I better use a mic.
Might be better with mine.
Is that better back there? Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I know some of you, this is a requirement that you have to have. It's not necessarily something you want to have, but I hope I can say something that's a benefit to you today. Quick introduction of myself. My name is Brent Ursenbach. My background is 33 years in HVAC contracting. 2005, I decided I'd had enough of trying to make payroll and collect money, and all you that are contractors know how sometimes that's kind of a challenge. And so I became a building inspector, and I did that through 2005. In the meantime, when I became an inspector, a number of the inspectors out there that knew me said, you know what, we need you to be teaching some mechanical classes. And so I started teaching some mechanical classes upon request. And when energy started to become a bigger issue in 2006, 7, and 8, I ended up being, receiving requests for that. Hopefully most of you know that the energy code has a very strong tie to all portions of the building. But there's a big tie to mechanical, and because as a mechanical contractor, I was fortunate enough to have a boss when I first started in 72 in that industry that taught me how to do load calculations by hand. Paper spreadsheets, we filled them all out and looked them all, everything up in the book. And so I've been doing load calculations now for one form or another for 49 years. And I'm sure some of you are hearing, or some of your jurisdictions are requiring load calculations. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how it all ties in. But basically, a load calculation is an analysis where we look at the thermal envelope of a building. And that thermal envelope is everything that divides conditioned from unconditioned space. So I imagine some of you that are general contractors have built houses that have a bonus room over a garage. And that bonus room over the garage has a unique thermal envelope because it's exposed to cold temperatures all the way around, basically, where the rest of the house is just exposed on 1 or 2 or 3 sides. And so those make a big difference on trying to keep that room comfortable, whether it's cool in the summer or warm in the winter. And so hopefully from some of this stuff we talked about today on the energy code, you'll catch a little bit about that. Again, if you have a comment or something, please feel free to raise your hand or holler out. I want to make sure your questions are answered and you walk out of here having gained something from it. As she mentioned, if you had paid for this class, she's going to send you a refund back. Part of what I do, I have a contract with the governor's office. Well, it's no longer the governor's office. It's just called the Utah Office of Energy Development. And I've been doing this back from when I was working for Salt Lake County for about 10 years now, 9-10 years, where I provide energy code training for free. And so I'm not charging UB Tech for this. I'm being paid under this contract that I'm working under. I'm also being paid to be a resource for you. So if you have a question that's somehow related to energy, which includes most mechanical, and the building envelope and everything, feel free to, and my email address is on the front page and on the back page of your handout. Feel free to send me an email and say, hey, I got a question, or I'm working with my building inspector and he's saying this thing, but that's not what you said in your class, and get some clarification. And so feel free to do that. And I'm doing that because of funding from all of these different people or different groups. We have, of course, the Office of Energy Development, DOE, Dominion Energy, and Rocky Mountain Power. So don't apologize if you send me a question or something, because I'm being paid to do it. So this morning, generally it breaks into two pieces. We're going to talk about compliance options, plan review, inspections, windows and doors. And you have a handout in front of you. And whether you're a building inspector or a contractor or even an HVAC contractor, jurisdictions are slowly coming up to speed and being more, I shouldn't say aggressive, but trying harder to enforce the energy code. With that, we have a lot of amendments. The Utah legislature has amended that energy code quite a bit. And so I put together a handout rather than you have to get out an IRC and look through all the Chapter 11 or get a hold of the IECC, the energy code, and look through the residential section and read through everything. I've done a summary sheet or a quick guide. I put this together 6 years ago or so, but it's been updated to include most recent amendments. So if you ever have a question like on what's my duct insulation requirement, it's on the back. If your building inspection, your jurisdiction says you have to turn in a res check for it every time you submit, that's technically not correct, because right the very first item on this sheet tells us that we have 5 options for complying with the energy code, and you can choose whichever one you want. So anyway, this may or may not be useful to you. This is available online if you want more copies, or you can send me an email. I can send you some more information on that. Something that's kind of interesting on it, as you see here, we have a little map of Utah, and it identifies our climate zones. The energy code is not the same for every location in the state, because we have a warm climate in Washington County, St. George area. We have a little bit cooler climate zone 5, which you can see includes the Wasatch Front and a lot of the state. And then you guys are in climate zone 6, because I don't need to tell you, you're colder than it is in Salt Lake here. You've probably been getting frost for quite a while out here, where we just had our first frost a week or so ago. And we do have a website, and it's divided, and it's UtahEnergyCode.com. It's divided into residential code, commercial code. We have some energy code blogs. That's little discussions that myself or someone else has written, and ways to contact us. And then we have we've recorded a lot of classes and posted them online. So let's say you're a contractor doing a commercial project. Storefront type curtain wall or curtain wall type windows with aluminum frames do not perform as well as the vinyl window that you're seeing in a house all the time, or a fiberglass window. So this type of window does not perform as well. Why? Because of the aluminum frame, and the aluminum frame is what? A better conductor or a poorer insulator. So I have a little 2-hour class on commercial windows, because I see lots and lots of times the windows do not comply with the code. And not only is it not compliant, but they condensate, and you have some of those issues with it. And I'm seeing a couple of heads nod, because the frames are just a great conductor, and you even get frost and everything collecting on the aluminum frame on the inside, which what does it do with your drywall and everything? You have a mess. So we have a number of things there, and if you send me an email, I might send back and say, well, go to this blog or go to this, and I'll send you a link to go to that. So if you're in that code and you hit residential, you'll have resources and training videos. And the resources include this quick guide that you just got, a list of all the amendments, and a couple other things. So feel free to use that site, especially if you're wanting to build a little bit more efficient product. You you might want to build better than the code. You might want to be remodeling your house or build yourself a new house, and you might want to build it a little bit better or a little bit more efficient than the code requires. I think everybody here would like to have a little bit lower energy bill. And some of the things we'll talk about are those very things that will result in a lower energy usage. This is just a list, and I'm not going to spend any time on it. This is a list of some of the training videos and stuff that we have on that website. Residential HVAC requirements for code compliance. Benefits from meeting the energy code. Mechanical ventilation. When I say mechanical ventilation, how many in here, and you don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to, but if you're willing to, how many understand what mechanical ventilation is? I imagine it's going to be a smaller number, but some of you HVAC people will be familiar with it. I'm sure most of you understand what I'm talking about when I say if you build a house tight, you might have poor indoor air quality. Yeah, so the code is pushing to build a tighter building, a tighter envelope. So we do Tyvek, we do caulking, we spray some foam, we do all these things to make it tighter. By making it tighter, what are we doing? We're not letting it breathe as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's becoming quite critical that we be thinking about that due to moisture and odors and viruses, and a well-ventilated building is actually more efficient than a loose building that we're trying to rely on just leakage. And there's there's many benefits to it. But anyway, I've talked about a lot of those things in here, and I'm just going to skip that. Welcome. And then we even have some YouTube videos that are in there too. Now here's some of the blogs or the discussions I wrote. Now, are we building townhouses out here like we are in other parts of the state? A few, not near as many probably as we are. We have townhouses going everywhere because the cost of property is so high out there. They're trying to make something affordable for people buying their house the first time. They're not very affordable, but they're building a lot of townhouses. When you do a townhouse, and I've written a little discussion on it that's on that website. When you work on a townhouse, how do we define the thermal envelope on a townhouse? What I see all the time is they say, well, I have this unit, the A unit or a B unit or whatever, and so I just look at the whole envelope. Well, when you have a townhouse or an apartment or whatever, do the common walls or the party walls, are they separating conditioned from unconditioned space? They are not, because we're conditioned on both sides, where we have a unit here and a unit here, and just a wall separating the two units. They're both conditioned, so we really don't have heat transfer between the units. Our heat transfer is to outside. Heat transfer is a function of two things, and this helps you understand the thermal envelope. Temperature difference and R value. So as we look at this room, this wall is the thermal envelope. This wall is not, that wall is not, that wall is not. It's just this wall is the thermal envelope. And then the edge of the slab is part of the thermal envelope. But everything else separates two conditioned spaces. And so when we are looking at or analyzing or trying to comply with the energy code, we're really looking at this wall. I think there's space above here, right? Conditioned space. And so we won't worry about that. If there's a roof straight above us, then that is part of the thermal envelope. But if there's another conditioned space above, that's not part of the thermal envelope. Anyway, so I wrote an article on townhouses because they're very often the energy code's misapplied. Okay, if I don't know how many are aware. Come on in.
Thank you.
It looks like we are not going to adopt a new residential code until 2023 at the earliest. We have been on the 2015 residential code since 2017. And so we've been on it for quite a while. And I want to make a point here. I think that's kind of important. I didn't put it on this slide, but the first point I want to make is we've been on the same code for 6 years almost, and how well are we doing in complying with the energy code? Well, I'm asking that question you as builders and those of you that are inspectors. And I dare say across the whole state, we could do better. Now, if we don't build according to the energy code, who's being hurt? Well, really, the person that buys a house. I don't know about you, but I think most of you are going to find that your second greatest expense in owning a home after your mortgage is your utility expense. It's bigger than your property tax. It's bigger than anything else. So if we can reduce that, we're putting money in the homeowner or the tenant's pockets. I think we could all do better on this. And I've been teaching this for quite a while. And every time I do, I think, what can I do to help people grasp onto this and be more interested in building a little bit more efficient home. But so it's going to be almost 8 years before we adopt a new code. And I'm not sure. I think we should be adopting the more current code, but I'm also of the opinion that we could do better than we're doing right now. Do you think we can be 90% compliant before 2023? I think we can do better, and we're doing a lot of stuff trying to do that. Friend of mine who does blower door testing.
I'm just going to make a comment there. You had down 23. People here know that they're not adopting the code in January 22. They're going to go one more year to 23, and then it'll probably go into effect in July that year. So we're actually going one more year than normal.
Yeah. Yeah. So we will have been on it from 17 at least till 2023. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's 2024, January 2024, by the time we get through everything.
And one thing, it doesn't affect a lot of people, but I just finished the ISO report, you know, that a lot of jurisdictions get. And I was flat told that our scores would go up because Utah is not adopting the codes in a timely manner.
Yeah.
Just a note of truth.
Yeah. There's a lot of, well, there's a number of things that have to do with this, our state and other states not adopting the most current code. And one thing that everybody needs to be aware of is if we have a natural disaster and FEMA comes in and pays benefits to homeowners, property owners, if you do not build to the most current code, which right now should be at least the 2018 code and real close to the 2021 code, the state's not going to get the money. So we could have a big flood, we could have an earthquake or something, and the state could be shooting everybody in the foot because they're not staying current with the code. Now, I know building code can be a dirty word to a lot of people, but I know a lot of people, myself included, that have been involved in the code development process, and there's a real effort to try to improve the code, to eliminate confusion, to remove stuff that is stupid, and to actually, every code proposal that I've ever written and submitted to ICC, I have to put down there, is there an increase in construction costs, a decrease or no impact on the cost. And so developing the code goes through a lengthy process, and we're really trying to make a code that is good for the public, but also that protects you, the contractor. I don't know if any of you have become aware of it, but there's a significant increase in litigation going on right now, construction defect litigation. And the best thing you can do to protect yourself is build by the code. I've been involved in several more cases than I want to as a witness on construction defects, and it really doesn't look good when a contractor's on the stand and they say, well, did you get a permit? Did you build by the code? And it doesn't fly if you say, well, yeah, I got a permit and I passed inspection. If it doesn't comply with the code, you're still liable. The inspector is required to enforce the code to the best of his ability. You're required to build by the code, and it doesn't have anything in there that says you're required to do what the inspector says. It says you're required to build by the code. So, you're protecting yourself by building by it. So anyway, I was talking about my friend Mitch. He blower door tests 3,000 plus homes a year, all the Energy Star homes and all these different homes, to determine how airtight they are, and also verifies other code requirements as a third party. And here he went around and he gave me a list. He had like 4 pages of pictures of houses, brand new houses under construction, and every one of them had serious failures as far as the energy code goes. And his response was, well, what do we need to do? And I mean, there's energy efficiency groups that have gone to Doppel and said, you know what, inspectors aren't enforcing it. We need to go after inspectors. Contractors are not building by it. We need to go after contractors and everything. And Doppel's first statement is, well, we don't have the people to do that. And their second statement is, well, you have a contract to teach these people. Let's try to teach them. So that's one of the reasons you have to have at least an hour of energy code training with your training today. So why do we have all this failure of non-compliance? And we can do this, right? I can say it's your fault or his fault or your fault, or it's my supplier, it's my subcontractor. We can blame it on everybody. But I think we really all have a little bit. And really the number one person, and I love it when I get an opportunity to teach architects, because if we can get them to put it on the plan, we have a whole lot better chance of getting it right, don't we? And I'm a little bothered that the legislature has said, well, you have to turn out your plan reviews so fast that you don't get a chance to get the plans correct. So, but if we could get the architects, the design professionals, to design a plan, and they knew what needed to be on the plan, everything goes smoother. I think that's the number one thing, and that's another piece of what I do. The number one thing is get the plan right. Jurisdictions, the plans examiners and inspectors, they have a role in this. The general contractor and the subcontractor has a role, the suppliers. I've had suppliers call me up before, and over the years, and said, what is this that I can't sell them R4.2 flex? Well, because it doesn't comply with the code. In fact, you need R8 in most of it. You can use some R6 in crawl spaces, but you need R8. And that doesn't fit the commercial energy code. You need R12, which they don't make. So you have to insulate, put additional insulation on. So they have a little bit. Doppel has a responsibility. And we'd like to say, well, the homeowner, he ultimately tells me what he wants. Well, how long is the homeowner going to live in that house? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? When the homeowner's done, are they going to tear down the house? No. So when we build a house, we're also trying to think about future homeowners. My son in Salt Lake, he had a home that was built in 1922. Pretty poorly insulated. In fact, there's nothing in the walls, just 2 layers of brick, and that was it. Pretty expensive house to heat and cool, and a really difficult thing to improve. We build a house today, and we take advantage of some of the options in the energy code and say, well, I'm going to build with 2x4s because it's cheaper, and use a 95% efficient furnace to pass the code. Well, that's fine, you pass the code, and it's a better house than was built 20 years ago. But we've kind of given up our chance to build a good wall, right? Pretty hard to improve that wall once we drywall and put the cladding on the outside. You can do it, but it's pricey. So everybody. So the architects in their Introduction to Codes and Standards, AIA, said they have a duty to protect the health, safety, and welfare. And I think that's great that they put the word welfare in that. Health we know about, safety we know about, what's welfare? That's your pocketbook, Dean.
I was gonna make a comment there on your last sheet on Doppel. I don't know if anybody attended. It's been last year or the year before Doppel came out here. It was actually over here in Vernal and had a training deal. And they were talking about the reduced requirements for contractor licenses. But in there, they stated one thing that they didn't increase was if you're not doing your work to code, you're now guilty of unprofessional conduct, which is anticipated so that they can regulate, address license forms, just to know that nobody was here to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So what Dean mentioned was the legislature has lessened the requirements to get a license. In fact, anybody that is a drywall contractor for 2 years can go, or any other contractor, landscape contractor, can go in and get a HVAC license. Kind of scary, isn't it? And we've seen the results of some of that. But, and what Doppel said when they came out here was, sure, it's easier to get the license, but if you do not build by the code, you're guilty of unprofessional conduct. And I actually have a slide in here that discusses that. So really what they're saying, and I can kind of see the point, we don't want the government to regulate everything. You know, they want to have less regulation. They don't want to make you go through a big test and all this stuff, and maybe the test sucks, and so it's of no value. I know the one that I took back in 1983 was the dumbest HVAC test I've ever seen in my life. But my license says I'm responsible to build by the code. And so I had a responsibility to know what the code said and to build by the code. And with that lessening requirements, they have maybe toughened or stiffened a little bit that you at least need some continuing education. So what it says about building inspectors, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but an inspector employed by any of these groups, including private groups, shall be subject to revocation or suspension of his or her license, or being placed on probation if found guilty of unlawful or unprofessional conduct. Isn't that the word you just used? Unprofessional conduct. Unprofessional conduct is defined as, and then they list a whole bunch of things, but number 3 is gross negligence in the performance of official duties as a building inspector. So if I went out inspecting a job, or anybody else that's inspector went out and said, you know, I think energy code's a bunch of BS, I'm not going to enforce it, I think that fits right in with gross negligence because I'm openly ignoring it. Now, if I don't understand it perfectly and I make a mistake, that's not gross negligence. But if I'm just doing the famous drive-by inspection, you know what that is? You drive by it right up the report. I didn't do that. What's the next one? And it's very similar. And this one is for the Construction Trades Act, and this is for the contractors. If licensed under this chapter, if you willfully or deliberately disregard or violate the construction laws of the state or any political subdivision, you're guilty of unprofessional conduct. So we adopt, in Utah, we adopt the codes by the legislative action. The governor signs it, and it's identified which codes we're on. And there's lots of resources on there that you can find them, and there's actually free access to the codes. So likewise, the contractor's guilty of unprofessional conduct. And then the awful is responsible for investigating persons and activities involved in violation of the provisions of this chapter, which includes those engaged in unlawful or unprofessional conduct. Now, I'm not trying to beat you up. I'm sure most of the people that are here do a good job and everything. You know, the people that typically don't go to training are the ones that need it the most. Is a big box store. You don't have a Home Depot or a Lowe's out here, do you? Yeah.
Lowe's.
You have a Lowe's. So when we first really, probably in 2007, 2008, I was running into a lot of homes where, you know, Lowe's and Home Depot, they require their people to get permits when they do services in a home, you know, updating services. And so I went out to do an inspection, and they had Lowe's change all their windows. And they put in windows that had a U factor of 0.48. Does that qualify? That's not compliant, is it? The U factor needs to now, you know, depending on which option you use, need to be down around 0.32 or 0.34 or someplace in that area. The lower the number, the better, please.
Does that window pass, if it passes the res check?
The 0.48 window would not pass a res check. This guy raises a great question, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I don't have a slide in here. If you replace windows in a house, do you have to do a res check on the whole house? That's pretty hard, isn't it? Because you'll never get it to pass if it's an existing house. So you might be able to, what res check says is, the code says you cannot use windows with higher than 0.48 U factor, period. Even with res check, you can't trade off a 5.0 window. It's beyond the limit. You could possibly trade off a 4.8 window in a res check on a new home or an addition, but you would have a real hard time doing it. You know, the windows are already the weak link. If when you go from an R3 window to an R2 window, which is what that question is asking us, it's almost impossible. You could add R100 in the attic, and you'd have to do like an R50 wall or something like that to get it to pass. So what do you do on a window replacement is you put in a window that complies with what we call the prescriptive table. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. So with these 5 options, we have some ways to deal with all the different things we deal with in construction. If we just had the code that says everything is done with res check, we'd never get a remodel to pass. It's an alteration, we'd never get it to pass without you doing what? Going through and redoing walls. And you know, what if you're doing a remodel or an addition and you don't change the windows in the existing part of the house? That's perfectly legal. But if you did a res check on that part of the house, you're never going to pass. So, real good question. We'll talk some more about it, and we'll come back to it. Being
One thing in addition, most time you get window change outs, they never get a permit, they never ask a question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're right. Most of the time, windows, they don't get permits, and sometimes the building department it's dang busy, they're not gonna push too hard on window permits or roofing permits or some of those types of things simply because they don't have the manpower. I think that's a safe statement, isn't it?
That's not so much manpower, at least out here, it can be, but you just never know what's happening.
Yeah.
You ask the question of what do I need to do or do I need?
Yeah. Yeah. Suppliers, you know, we could go into a whole conversation about what's required to, when are you required to get a permit by the code? And probably get tied up in that one longer than we want to. Talk to your building inspector. Should a buyer of a new home expect an energy efficient home compliant with the adopted codes? I've had this asked me so many times. About 7 years ago, just as we were coming out of the recession, they built a new 13-lot little subdivision across the street from me, a little cul-de-sac. And the people all moved in and they saw the truck because I had a county vehicle. And when they realized the inspector, they say, well, is my house a pretty good house? Yeah, our house is a good house. Is it most efficient? Well, it meets the energy code, but it wasn't the most efficient. And if the jurisdiction that I live in does enforce and has enforced the energy code, but there's others that don't. So should that person buying a new home expect an efficient home? I think they should. The average price of a house back where I live is crazy right now, and I'm sure yours have gone up too. Please.
Just a thought, I don't know who you ever talked to, but why isn't a home appraised for more money when it's insulated correctly?
Why isn't a home appraised for more money when it's insulated correctly?
You know that?
I love that comment.
Maybe something's tied, I don't have tied into the state already, but keeps the appraisal.
One, new in the code, and this ties right into what I was talking about earlier, that we're really trying to improve the code. And what's in the code now, our fourth option is what we call the energy rating index, or the HERS rating. And if we were to build one way, it would be that way, because if every single home, new home built, a score, and the score is lower than your home better. It's basically how efficient is the home. And that would be and you nailed, you completely nailed it. That would be the very best thing for everybody. Because you as builders and subcontractors, your efficiency improvements that you add to a home, the quality of the installation, the quality of your HVAC are all recognized when that home is scored. And I mean, it's a no-brainer when you think about it, isn't it? But, and if the mortgage companies, you know, there's been some stuff in Congress, but we all know how Congress works, right? That mandates that mortgage underwriting include energy costs of the home. I just talked a minute ago about it. We build a house, and my friends at the home builders rightly so are concerned that if we add extra expense building the house, we're cutting some people out of the green of owning a home. But if we're cutting the requirements and not adopting the most current energy code, what's happening to the green of those people that they barely can get into a house? Then it's an energy rate. They're going to lose the house because they can't afford it to be $400 a month utilities. So, excellent comment. Thank you. And we're going to talk some more about that one.
Just for information, Scott's up for insulation. It's pretty close.
Well, great. Welcome.
Hold it against
Hey. An insulation.
The recording, yay!
Concerned about doing a good job and concerned about insulating a home well. You want to do a good job, right? You want to do some homes, you want to do some. There's a lot that can be done with it. quality of the installation. You know better than me. And you have competitors, I'm sure, that don't do a very good job.
We're pretty good at it.
Are you pretty good at it? Good, good. So, bottom line is the average cost of a new home in Utah now is approaching $500,000. And someone spent that much money and it's poorly insulated or poorly heated, or, you know, poorly sealed, poor windows, whatever the case may be. Our friend Carl from Duchesne, Carl's in Duchesne, isn't he?
Yes,
Oh, Carl Mott. He says it drives him crazy when people from county government say we need to have affordable housing, and they think affordable housing is a 30-year-old double wide that's on propane that costs you $500 a month to heat. Is that affordable housing? There's nothing affordable about that, is there? Affordable housing needs to be very well built so that it is affordable. Utility bills, they're expensive. And I assume you have a lot of propane out here, don't you? Propane's more than natural gas. It's expensive. So, still talking about the defects or the errors. Code requirements are often disregarded. And the first one is the compliance options. It's in the corner, first thing on your sheet. We have 1 through 5, and number 5 is a state amendment. We have those 5 options, and oftentimes they haven't even picked one, and they just build away. Complete construction documents, air barrier insulation inspection or blower door test. So we're going to talk about each one of these. Open combustion furnaces. This one has bugged me way back from when I was an HVAC contractor in Dominion Energy. Back then, I was either Questar or Mountain Fuel. Came around and said, we're building our houses too tight. We got to cut a hole in the side and bring in combustion air. And so we had this combustion air requirement. You had to bring in 2 pipes horizontally, and they had to be huge, 1 square inch per 2,000 BTUs. And so my house that I bought in 2005 was built in 92 under that rule, and I had 2 10-inch pipes coming in from outside into my house. There is absolutely no logic to that, is there? Well, we're finally in the code to address that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Ducts outside the thermal envelope, leakage testing. Our hottest climate in Utah, St. George area, don't build basements because of soils or whatever, and put everything in an attic. And it's the dumbest thing you could do for energy is sticking all that stuff in the attic, because it costs you 40% more to cool your house because it's sitting up there in that blazing hot environment. If you can get that stuff out of the attic, and not doing load calculations or designing our duct correctly, and then ventilation. So let's jump on and we'll talk a little bit more about those. So let's talk about the compliance options real quick. The first one is prescriptive table, and that is on your sheet. It's in 2 columns. It starts in the front, bottom of the middle column, and then jumps up to the right-hand column. And those are the prescriptive values for Utah. Climate zones 3, 5, and 6. And so our first option is you just build the code like that. So in climate zone 6, if you have a crawl space, you either put R15 continuous insulation if you want to condition the crawl space, R15 around on the exterior walls, or 19 if you put it in a cavity. 0.32 windows, 0.55 on a skylight, wood frame wall, 20 plus 5 or 13 plus 10. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Mass walls, that's like logs and ICF, concrete walls, a floor R30, and so on. We look at that, and you see that the fenestration U factor is 0.32. So that changing out the windows, the question on changing out the windows, rather than do a res check, you just make sure you put in 0.32 or lower windows. You comply with the code. And that's what you need to do with a lot of your alterations and additions. Just use the prescriptive table, because doing the res check is really difficult. And what I am saying, yeah, if you're going to build an addition on the house, you're probably going to want to build it with 2 to 6, or you're going to build it with 2 to 4s and then put an inch of foam on the outside, and then you can comply with the prescriptive table. It's just like a recipe or something. Do all those things, you comply. Well, the next option is the res check, where you say, well, I'm going to be weak on one of these things, and so what am I going to do? I'm going to be stronger on another. So I'm weak on a wall, I'll go stronger on a furnace. Stronger on the windows. And it still passes, because we do a trade-off. The third one is a simulated performance approach, and that's an energy model done with, we have a standard reference design home, we have the home we want to build, and we go through this, inputting all this data, and we estimate what the energy costs are going to be on your new house. And then we compare it to what the energy cost would be on that standard reference home that's basically built to the prescriptive table. And if your energy cost is going to be less, you comply. Not very common, not used very much. And then the next one, the number 4, the ERI, Energy Rating Index, or HERS rating, and that's what we were talking about, is we give the home a score. Really, it's ideal. Oops, and then the last one is the Utah 2012 Res Check. Back in the 2006 Energy Code, it allowed you to say, well, okay, I'm going to put in a crappy window, I'm going to build a poor wall, but I'm going to put in a 92% efficient furnace and get credit for the increased efficiency of that furnace, and you could pass. In the 2009 code, the code writing body and all those people that participate in that process, and that was the first time I participated, the decision was made that we have one opportunity to do a wall right, and to allow it to be traded off with a high efficiency furnace, we kind of thrown away our chance to build a better wall. And so the code eliminated the equipment trade-off from res check in 2009. Well, Utah didn't like that, the legislature didn't like it, so we didn't adopt the 2009 residential code. And when the 2009 residential code, so when 2012 came along, the legislature said, okay, we'll adopt the 2012 code with some amendments. However, we need a res check that allows that equipment trade-off, that still allows you to build with poor windows, poor walls, and take advantage of high efficiency furnaces and high efficiency air conditioners. And so we convinced DOE to write a res check for us that did that. And so we have a loophole, and that still allows, you to use a furnace for a trade-off. And currently you have to pass by 5%. It kind of stepped up. But anyway, that is about 5 to 10% less efficient than the other 4. So if you build a home using the Utah 2012 res check, you're building a less efficient home. It passes, but it's less efficient. So I'm going to come right out and say res check is not mandatory. And if your building department might say, well, yeah, we want a res check because it's simple. Well, I understand that, but really the code allows you to use any one of these 5. This one just kills me. I've heard too often someone say, we don't review energy in the office on plan review, we just worry about it in the field. Let the inspector worry about it. Well, that's not very good when the inspector gets out there in the field and the windows don't comply. Do you fail it and say, well, rip out all your windows and start over? How many general contractors want to be failed on windows where you have to yank them all out and start over? That's horrible. So we need to be reviewing for energy code and making sure that we at least have the basic method of compliance on the plans. That doesn't work. We have the 5 options. Like I say, res check is not mandatory. And I will say also that res check and the prescriptive options don't address air barriers and air sealing. What that's really saying is we have some mandatory requirements. We pick one of those and comply with that, and then we have some mandatory requirements that apply no matter which one of these 5 you choose. So on the sheet, it's on your sheet here, talks about construction document, second item. U factors, R values, another pertinent data shown and identical on the plans, energy compliance reports, HVAC design, etc. So here's what I encounter all the time, and I do some reviews for California, both commercial and residential, and for Nevada and for Utah. And what I find is the plan says we're going to put R13 or R19 or whatever in a wall. The res checks has a different number for the R value in the wall. The HVAC guy did a load calculation. He has a different number on it. How are we going to get the house built right? It needs to be consistent across all of them. The U factors and the R values need to be the same on all those documents. So if you're getting a plan drawn or developed for you to build a house, you need to make sure the plan identifies what the U factors for windows and doors is and what the R value for your insulation is going to be. So your HVAC guy knows, so your energy guy, whether it's your HVAC guy or your insulation contractor, whoever does that, so everybody uses the same numbers. It makes a difference if we have different R values. A couple of definitions that we need to make sure everybody understands, and this one, there's been a lot of confusion on it. We will take at about 10:30, we'll take just a 10-minute break. 10:25, 10:30. Continuous air barrier. We need to have something on our building that's continuous, that stops air leakage. Continuous insulation. Continuous insulation is insulation that is not broken by some type of framing member or something. So we insulate this wall, we're putting the insulation in the cavity, right? So we call that cavity insulation. Continuous insulation would be if I put foam on the exterior. The only thing that can penetrate continuous insulation is a fastener. Now I've seen hundreds and hundreds of res checks that say for our attic insulation that they have R13 or R15 cavity insulation, which is the insulation that's laying on the lids where we have the bottom cord of the truss. And then they're calling the insulation that's above that 3.5 inches, everything above, they're calling it continuous because it goes over the top of those. It does, but it is broken by the intermediate cords or members of the truss. And so by definition in res check and in the load calculation procedures and ASHRAE and the code, that is not continuous. It's still cavity. Because why? Because a 2x4 or a 2x6 or whatever is penetrating every so often. If you take a thermal camera and look at that ceiling, you can see where every one of those cords come down through, and you can see that the heat flow, that goes through those. What's the R value of wood? Anybody know? It's about R1 per inch. So I have a 2x6 wall, and I put R19 or even R21, or I net and blow and even have a 23 or 24 in the cavity. Every place that there's a stud, it's R5.5. And so it is not a whole wall of that higher R value. When you average it all out, it's going to be less because of the thermal bridging through the framing members. You come into this building, and I'll bet you there's metal studs behind here, and it's worse because metal studs are terrible insulators and great conductors of heat, and so it's even worse. So cavity insulation is broken by some type of framing. Continuous insulation has nothing but a fastener. So insulation on a commercial building roof deck, or even a home that builds with a flat roof, I don't know how many do that, but occasionally someone does. If you put the foam on top, that's continuous insulation. If you put the foam underneath where it's broken by trusses or rafters, that's cavity. What's a residential building? A residential building, as we look at energy, is a 1 and 2 family dwelling, townhouses, apartment buildings, anything R2, 3, or 4, 3 stories or less below grade. So you build an apartment building that's 3 stories high and needs to comply with the residential energy requirements, where if it's 4 stories high, it needs to comply with the commercial. And any R1 or hotel or motel is commercial, no matter what. So you'll notice from my little map of Utah that the climate zones are based on county lines. And I imagine that in some of your counties out here, you have a couple of counties, don't you? What counties do you have here? And how far north do those counties go? All the way up. And so they go up pretty high. I mean, you're not building too much in those real high elevations, but you do build in some elevations are higher than you are right here. And they might, if you were to really look at it closely, they might be a climate zone 7 or 8 with the conditions, you know, because they're really cold. I put in here as an example, I work for Salt Lake County, and Snowbird, the ski resort up Little Cottonwood Canyon, they built what they call the Snowbird Summit on top of the tram, where the tram stops, and it's 11,000 feet. But according to the code, and according to the table, that's climate zone 5 because it's in Salt Lake County. My point is, as an inspector for the county, I could not force them to build according to climate zone 6 or 7, but I could surely recommend that because it's a whole lot colder at Snowbird than it is in the valley, that they maybe step up their insulation a little bit. So it's just a thought to consider if you're building, you know, a summer home or, you know, that cabin up in the Uintas on the south slope someplace, that maybe you suggest that maybe they want to insulate a little bit better, especially because they're going to be heating it with, you know, possibly propane or something that's more expensive. Yeah, this is a 23,000 square foot building. It's a big building. And it was a nice building. And the first comment that I got from people when I put a picture of it up is, and it's all glass. Yeah, it is, because they did a trade-off. They did a performance trade-off on that building. Okay, real quickly, you're supposed to, when you finish a house, you're supposed to put a certificate someplace down by the panel that identifies what the insulation is, what your performance of your windows is, so that anybody coming in later on knows how the house was built. Now, if this would have been in place a long time ago, it would have sure made my HVAC career a lot easier, because I would go out on an existing home. Someone wants a new furnace, they want to add air conditioning for the first time. So I'd want to survey the home and look at what the windows are and what the insulation is and everything. And lots of times I had to make some assumptions based on how old the house was. And, you know, I could pull a switch cover off and see if it was even insulated in the cavity and do some of those things. But if I knew it was a 2x6 instead of a 2x4, if I knew what was originally put in the walls, if I knew what the original windows were, then I could have more accurately determined what size air conditioner they needed, and in turn, what types of duct improvements that need to happen. This one has not been enforced as much as some, but it's a pretty good idea, I think. So here are our 5 options. Prescriptive, I mentioned that, that's just, you follow the recipe, you do the res check where you can do some trading off, you do that performance model, you do the HERS rating. We'll go into a little more detail where we actually give the home a score. The lower the number, the better. If it has a score of 0, what would that mean? It's really good. It means it uses no energy off the grid from coming off, taking energy off the grid. It's completely self-sufficient. What's another word we'd have for that, or phrase? Net zero. A net zero home would be a home that we build really well, and it might have a score of 25 or 30. So it's really high performance, so much that by putting a reasonable number of PV panels on the roof, we can meet all the energy requirements for the home. Now, I'm not proposing that that's our goal today, because that's crazy expensive. And I don't have anything against PV panels, but I think if you have the money to put PV panels on your roof, you ought to build a better envelope first, because you save money without putting the panels on just by building a better envelope. But we'll talk some more about all of these. And then our Utah one that I discussed briefly. And it started out in 17, you only had to pass by 3%, then it went to 4%, then it went to 5%. When this was first developed, I ran between 50 and 100 different res checks on this software and on the standard software without the amendments built into it. And the number I came up with is this should have been between 7 and 10%. So we should have required a lot bigger number. But the legislature chose to use a smaller number and just kind of step increase it. But it's still roughly 5% worse. It was 7 to 8% worse. It just depends on the house a little bit. But yeah, it is an option, but it's not as efficient of a home. So there's the prescriptive table. I've cut it down, made it smaller when I put it on here, because we don't care about climate zones 1, 2, 4, 7, and 8, because we don't have that in Utah. So why include it on my slide? You'll notice I have a footnote here on this that says see the footnotes. So there's footnotes here that kind of give us a clarification. The number one thing that I wanted to point out here was, well, there's two things. The first one is in walls. If we look at climate zones 3 and 5, it says R20 or 13 plus 5. What that means is R20 in a cavity, or 13 plus 5 is R13 in the cavity and R5 on the exterior. So the 5 is continuous. But what happens when I get to climate zone 6? It doesn't have it does have an OR, but the OR is between two sets of numbers that both have some continuous insulation on them. So if you build prescriptively here, you have to either build with 2 to 6 and put R5, 1 inch of pink or blue foam on the outside, or R13, a 2 to 4, with 2 inches of foam on the outside. Continuous. That's prescriptively. You can go to res check, you can trade it off, that you don't have to do that. Why is the code for climate zone 6, 7, and 8 mandating on the prescriptive table that we have some continuous foam on the outside? Anybody dare to venture as, you want to venture? What happens, well, I'm not going to try to draw in that little tiny corner. If I have a wall, well, this is a little thicker, so this is a wall, looking at a cross section of a wall, inside and outside. With me? So I have OSB sheathing, and then I have some type of cladding, whether it's stucco or hardy or whatever we put on the outside, vinyl siding, I don't care. We have some type of cladding. So we have the cladding, no foam, piece of OSB, our studs and our cavities, right? What's the temperature of the inside or backside of the OSB when it's 10 degrees down here, up here, whatever? If it's 10 degrees outside, what's the backside of the OSB, the inside surface?
Probably 10 degrees.
It might be 15.
It's low.
It's low, isn't it? Because what's on the other side of it? All the insulation, right? So we have a nice blanket or cavity of insulation, and the backside of our backside of our OSB is cold. And the colder our climate, the colder that temperature. When I got this out of the fridge this morning, what happened to the outside surface of the
Moisture's condensates.
it condensated, didn't it? Why? Yep, it's cold. It condensed the moisture out of the air, correct? So we build a house in a cold climate. We don't ventilate it correctly. We allow moisture to build up inside the house, right? And what happens when it gets cold outside? The moisture gets around through the insulation, because fiberglass doesn't stop any transfer of air or heat, you know what I mean? And the moist air hits the backside of the OSB and it condenses. Is OSB resistant to moisture? It's horrible, isn't it? Plywood's better than OSB. Plywood isn't, you can buy plywood that's, better. We go exterior and we go marine and stuff like that. But OSB, you get it wet too many times and we know what it just comes apart. So here we are, we're condensing all this moisture on the backside of our OSB. So the prescriptive table is the first step in saying, in our cold climates, we really need to do a better job of preventing condensation in our wall cavities, because they do create problems. The worst place for it is rim joists, because rim joists leak a lot of air. And if it's a rim joist in a crawl space, I can just about guarantee you go into any crawl space that's conditioned, or even some of the unconditioned ones, and pull that little piece of insulation out of the rim, you're going to find mold, almost guaranteed, because we're not putting a good vapor barrier on the ground. The moisture's coming out of the ground and it goes to that cold spot, and the insulation doesn't stop the air moving through it because it doesn't have an air barrier over it. So what should you really do for your rim joists? Talk to the gentleman out back there and spray foam, closed cell foam on your rim joists. And really.
Actually, those rim joists, you're getting penetration all, let's say a hose bib and that, and not even moisture coming this way, and you can touch it and they'll have frost.
Yeah, yeah. All the penetrations of the rim, the hose bibs, the refrigerant lines for air conditioners, all those things are just, they're sources of problems. We're building good homes and we're building them tighter and stuff like that, but because we're trying to conserve a little bit of energy, we're creating some other conditions that if we don't react to them and don't do the proper building science procedures, we're going to have some problems. And we have it, we see them. I was involved in a case up by Park City where they had those townhouses, and they had fireplace pop-outs, you know what I mean, that went up the outside of the building, more decorative than anything. And they put stone over them. I call it lick and stick, just cultured stone that they stuck across all of them. And they'd had some problems before doing some of those because you transition from stone to siding and they were getting moisture in there. And so they got this great idea that they put gray ice and water shield, and they started like a foot on the wall and then out and wrapped all the way around, and they did it all the way up. What did that do? That put a vapor barrier on the cold side, so that moisture that collects on the back side of the OSB has no chance ever of drying to the outside. In fact, they're trapping it And in about 3 years, the stone's fallen off because the OSB was falling apart inside. I'd come in and tear it all off, all the way up, resheathe it, redo the whole thing. Can you imagine the expense of doing that? Yes.
Just talking about insulation, because I don't be honest, unless you got a private home, nobody's insulating outside of the sheet. How does it work when they do like the number two, a 2-pound foam? They do 1 inch on the interior. How does that affect?
Okay, his question is, you're not seeing much foam on the exterior, right?
If it's not a directly elastomer type, you know.
With EFA system or whatever you want. Yeah, yeah. And that's unfortunate, and I get it because it's hard to do it. My existing home that I bought in 2005 was 2 stories on the back side all the way up, aluminum siding, aluminum frame windows that were terrible. And when I went to replace them, I was cutting the siding back and I was going to do a band so I could flash them properly. Well, they hadn't been flashed properly to start with, and I had rot everywhere, so I stripped the whole thing off and put 1.5 inches of polyiso, which is about R9, almost R10 on the outside. But it's a pain because you got to box around all your windows, and I mean it's an involved process. So I could see why people aren't doing it unless they're putting a synthetic stucco with foam on it. Obviously, when you do foam on the exterior, you solve a lot of those condensation problems because why? Because the inside surface is warmer because we've insulated it. Dean's comment is, okay, we'll spray some foam. It does the same thing. It helps a lot because the inside face is warmer if it's warm enough. I mean, this water is still cool, but it's not wet anymore because I came up above dew point. So the moisture is still there. What we're trying to do is keep the surfaces above dew point. And maybe they get a little bit of moisture on them once in a while, but then it dries off. We just don't want to be soaked, saturated all the time. There's our problem.
And actually, anybody that's been into mold training, and they've taught this for 20, 25 years of insulating that outside and getting that dew point to move, but it hasn't happened.
Yeah, I know a lot of people say, oh, that stupid energy code's making me do this and that and that. Energy code's based on building science. And we can whine and everything all we want, but we're not going to change what we call the Psychometric Chart, which is the chart that tells us where we change from vapor to liquid state. And we can plot out, depending on how humid it is and what the temperature is, when we're going to hit dew point. So our dew point temperature goes up when we're more humid. If we're drier, then we don't have as big a problem. But what do? We build this type thing and we say, oh, we're just going to open the windows for ventilation, and no one opens the windows, so we trap all the moisture in our building, and then we have a dew point problem. I mean, how many bathtubs in my first house was a little 2-bedroom Rambler I bought in 1974, and had 1 bathroom, 2 bedrooms, and you know what the bathroom looked like. You walked in the door, there's a lab, a toilet, and a tub, right? With a shower, and a little window in there. And I always had mildew or mold or something growing right up at the top corner. Because why? Because the trusses came down to almost nothing, and I had about that much insulation. And so it was always cold, and the moisture from the shower always condensed there. It's building science. It's psychometrics. It's dew point. I mean, that's all there is. And so, these are the things I'm glad you're bringing up, and you're bringing up stuff so we can talk about it. And you walk out of here, even though this is code class, maybe you have some knowledge that's going to help you in your own home or in what you're building.
One more question and I'll quit.
No, it's okay.
I mean, you've heard of construction, it's been thrown around, I'm surprised that we haven't seen it. They've been talking, going back to 2-4 framing and doing it all on the outside, but you're not seeing necessarily. You know, I've heard it for 5-10 years that they're gonna go back to building 2-4, but you never see it. Is there anything actually being proposed, something like that?
So the question is, a lot of talk about going back to 2-4 with a lot of exterior foam. There's a number of studies and a lot of practical applications now in Canada and Alaska where they build exactly that way. They build with 2-4s, they put nothing in the cavity, and they put 4 or 6 inches on the outside. And so we don't have the cavity issues at all. And they just leave the cavities open for your wires and everything, and you know, you're done. Any insulated concrete forms used out here? Anybody built with ICF? Little bit. How many are familiar? How many have not seen ICF? Anybody dare raise their hand? The big Lego blocks. There's styrofoam with little connectors in them, a layer of foam on the outside, a layer of foam on the inside, and you pour it full of concrete with rebar. So you have a structural wall, and you have 2 layers of continuous foam, one on the outside, one on the inside. Super airtight. If you build with those and you don't ventilate, you're going to have a sick house because they don't leak. But it's a super insulated house because it has 5 to 6 inches of continuous foam at somewhere around R5 per inch, or maybe even a little higher. Some of the spray foams are like R7 per inch.
I'm gonna say most of the I've only seen one ICF complete home other than the roof, but it all has that white paint. The R value, and that's pretty low.
It's less. It might be 3 or 4 per inch, but it's still better than fiberglass. But it's tight. The thing is no air leakage, and it's 2 layers, and you have a mass in there, concrete. Yeah, concrete's a poor insulator, but in our climates here where we have high temperature swings each day, like in the summertime, the heat hits it, and it has to get through that first layer of foam, and then it takes a lot of heat to heat up the concrete. Well, before that concrete's even completely heated up, we've gone past to the end of the day, and it's starting to move back the other direction. So there's some other advantages. It's all, again, building science to building with that. But no, I think someday we will see in all of our cold climates, we'll just be seeing foam products on the outside as people develop, you know, ways to do it. And you can go on YouTube and see different ways that different contractors are putting the foam on the outside. Typically, they put something down, whether it's a mesh material or some little sleepers to nail the cladding to, so you still have an airspace and a path for water to move down. But yeah, it's the whole thing with it becoming mandatory in the code is the cost. And the code is going to go in smaller incremental steps simply because the cost. So res check, and I'm gonna go through these pretty quick, simply because of time. In fact, we'll do a couple of them, then we'll take a break. If a res check is done, the first thing that you need to know is that it was built to a compliant code. Now, if someone wants to do a res check to the 2021 code, they can, because it's better than the 15 or the 18 or the Utah 2012. But if you do the second option, which is the 2015 res check, then your code should say that. All this information should be filled out, and it will have a pass rate if it passes. And then every component of the thermal envelope must be listed and accurately listed on the res check. So here's one that was sent to me from the St. George area. And so they wrote my name on it to send it to me. They faxed it to me or emailed it to me. And it passed by 53%. Do you think there's anything wrong with this res check? Guarantee you there's a bunch of stuff wrong with this res check. And I could go down through the whole list, but the big one is that they said the windows had a U factor of 0.05, which is R20, and that has solar heat gain coefficient of also 0.05. I don't know if how many of you know anything about windows, but if you could build a window that had a 0.05 U factor, I want to partner with you, and we're going to sell these windows, and we're going to become billionaires, because that's a crazy number for a window. This window right here in those aluminum frames is going to have a U factor someplace around 0.5. To convert U to R, we divide by the other, so into 1. So if we have a 0.5 U factor, we go 1 divided by 0.5, it's 2. So that's an R2 window. You go buy a window from Amsco or something, and it's a 0.33 window, and I'm using that number for a reason. And we'd go 1 divided by 0.33, and what do I get? 3, right? And you can get your calculator and check, but I guarantee you 1 divided by 0.3333 it's a third, right? So if you divide by a third, you get 3. You divide 1 by a third, it's 3. So a good window is an R3 window. A really good window, a triple pane, all the low E coatings and everything, might get down to a 0.2, 0.18 or something. That's an R5 window. You know, most manufacturers are now making windows in vinyl and fiberglass that are double coats, and they get down into the 2.8s and even approaching 0.25 on the U factor, so they're approaching R4, and that's a really good window. So our weak thing is our windows, but if you see a res check with a number that's that high, it's a big red flag. And because they put a garbage number in there that's completely 100% unattainable. I mean, if they had put 0.15, I would have said, no, let me see. You know, I'd want specs on a triple pane window with lots of coatings. So, you know, it's trying to become familiar with all that, and you can't, but you can talk to your window guy, and you can get those specs and get them accurate. Here's another one that passed by barely, and this one was used in the 2012 or the Utah Energy Code, and it said it passed by 1.9%. Well, that doesn't pass because you have to pass by 5%. And they put in that the windows were 0.8. That's BS too. No one's selling them 0.8 windows, so they didn't know what they were doing, and so they were trying to do some other stuff. They were listing that they had, and this was townhouses, and they were putting in the party walls and putting R13 in a cavity, and then they were trying to get credit for the OSB and the drywall. You can't do that. When you pick a wall assembly and res check, it's already accounted for the OSB and the drywall and the cladding. All you put in is the cavity. So I'm going to jump through that one real quick. We're just going to hit a couple more, then we'll go to a break. This has a column here, and it says you put in your gross area, you put in cavity insulation, you put in continuous insulation, and then you have your U factors. If you put in insulation values, it calculates your U. If it's a window or a door, you need to input it. Same type of thing, they inputted a bad number. This one they have said that the windows are 0.28. That's attainable, but you need to verify it. They have R19 in a 2 to 6, and they're putting R4 on the outside. So if I get this res check, or if Dean or someone gets this res check, he should be looking at the plans to make sure it has at least R4 on the exterior of the wall. Otherwise, we know it's not going to get built that way, right? He's putting R19 in a cavity, so we should be looking for 2 to 6. Okay, let's take a break. 10 minutes. Let's be back here at 22. I know you need to stretch because you've been sitting.
Actually, I do get, I have a great big coffee percolator. My sleep, I get up and water a little bit or something, and then I move some, and if I need to get some oil, as I've gotten older. Instead of a 2.5-hour bladder, I like one. That's what I thought earlier.
Hey, I used to be able to drive to St. George without stopping.
Oh, really?
I didn't drive here without stopping.
Like I said, I tell people, it depends on how long I want to sleep at night. I kind of like beer, but with the medications, I can't really. So I tell them that too, I can sleep pretty good. If I have 3 of them every 2.5 hours, if it's 4, it's every hour and a half.
Yeah.
It just depends on how otherwise I want to sleep. But if you could drive to St. George, I can.
I could when I was younger.
Yes, sir.
I can't now. No, I used to do it quite a bit, you know. Yeah, I need to go when I got there because I usually drink
Oh, bad.
you know. Yeah. And I drank a little caffeine last night. And that, I didn't sleep very well. I was like, yeah.
Yes, sir.
I didn't leave until 6. I thought the whole thing almost it was dark by the time I hit the Provo Canyon.
Yes, sir. So do you live down in the Provo area then?
I live in South Georgia. So, you know what, it's, when I go to New Meadows, I go to Provo Canyon. I'd rather go down with my trailer than park.
Oh, yes, sir.
And I get on. I live off 106, so I just get on the back out.
I gotta take my hat off to you. See, I'm from Mason. I moved down here 27 years ago, and actually in the 80s, I drove to Salt Lake. I was over in Gable Brothers on 72nd South. That was our hub anyway. I thought the Mason freeways were bad. Now I hate just going to Mason and get from there to Combustion with the traffic and stuff. And I'm praying there's not an accident.
Oh, yeah.
I hear get stuck.
Yeah. Well, how many lanes are south of the mountain now? Like 7 or 8.
Yes, sir.
So we get off the Thanksgiving point and all that.
I'm living out here. I go down there and I'm going 65 over the freeway, and everybody else is doing 80, giving me the sign, hey, you old bugger, get going.
Yeah. It's a. It's not so bad because I don't have to go anywhere for the most part. I don't have to be at the office in the morning. I work out of my house and all the reviews and everything. You know, yeah, I have to go someplace sometime. I don't think my truck will take 2 days or 3 days, but I had last night to come here.
Well, I have 2 little trucks and a big one. The big one only moves when I need to move something. I call them a Cadillac. I tell my girlfriend, this is my Cadillac. We're going to take care of it because this is the last big truck I'm going to buy at the price of it.
Yeah. Well, mine I've had, I only got 50,000 miles on it. It's a 14.
Mine's a 6 with only 50,000. And I take care of it. Actually, I live in Mountain Home. My front yard is 7,100 feet, so I've had snow. Actually, there was still snow in my yard yesterday. I got 3 the other day and 4 a week ago, and that. But it comes with it. I like it. It's nice and quiet.
Well, I bought a truck. It's a Silverado. It's not an HVAC. But it's heavy. They haul more than a half ton used to.
Oh, yes.
But still. It's expensive. And it's a short bed, because I just don't need a long arm.
Right.
But it's a nice one. Wife's loaded up on the CIP because it's longer, higher.
Yeah, my truck's, oh, it's just like a mega cab, but it's got a standard cab with an 8-foot bed. You gotta pick your partner, or you're not gonna get back out.
Yeah, I bought it approved. Mine's full size door. And it's I really use it.
Oh, yeah. That's
I
amazing.
have double stick.
I used to do heavy hauls. Now I don't do as much. I mean, I almost don't go anywhere anymore. I just stay in Mount Home. I mean, there's so many people coming out here on the weekends anymore, winters and stuff.
Well, I have a trailer and I tow it up into the US. I didn't much this year, I was just too busy.
I actually went to Evanston about in June, and I hadn't been years. I worked in Evanston for 6 years. And I came back over to Mirror Lake, and this was on a Friday. I could not believe the number of people that were up there again. I didn't see a single spot that wasn't, and there was big old trailers dumped in everywhere. I'm going, how the world they get in there?
We don't go to weekends.
Yes, sir. You're smart. Yes, sir.
But still, you have to reserve them. Lots of times it's not a good spot. Or you have to get up early to get those pull-off spots.
Yeah, I used to go starvation quite often. Weekends anymore. No, if I can't get off in the middle of the week,
We have so many people here.
I better let you go.
I'm So you say you're a general contractor? That's good. You do new construction? You do new construction? Both?
Our shops are all built, we've been traveling around here a little bit, and midway along. It's on a while, it's still moving.
Yeah, I did, my last project I did, I got rid of most of my people in 2003 and 4, I did some townhomes and it's crazy. I mean, it's a cool place, but it's not big now. It's kind of small.
I grew up and lived in Lehigh. In fact, I worked at a shopping company in Salt Lake until my dad worked there for 47 years. Got married, moved out to Alabama. So, it's so nice to come home.
Well, I've thought about it, but as long as I have the majority of my grandkids in the Salt Lake Valley, my wife, I'll consider it.
I get it. I worked all over here for 6 months.
Yeah.
It was such a good shop.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, my wife right now has my daughter, she has 4 kids, but the youngest has 3 families in Hawaii that can imagine taking a 3-year-old. So we have the 3-year-old for 12 days. But she's been pretty good. And she was, yeah, she's on grandma pretty ragged. Give her a break. Class tomorrow in Salt Lake. Right, I'll take the 3-year-old. Because we have her till next Wednesday still.
Oh, geez. Yeah. You trying to be not glad to see her gone, but ready.
Yeah, we'll be ready. She's been really good. I was surprised. I thought she'd be worried. Where's my mom? I want my mom. But grandma's spoiled the heck out of her, so it's all right. But yeah, in fact, my wife wants to move closer to her own, like 15, 20 minutes away. No, we're not moving because Jared gets it. My son wants a job someplace. They want me to move.
Yeah, there you are. Yeah.
He's a CPA and someone hires him away. And, you know, one of these days it's going to be out of state. So I'm not going to move for that.
No.
Okay. Did the clip art get all the way around?
Yeah, yeah.
You don't want
No.
to come back. All of it.
Didn't get it.
Yeah, there's some. I just need to hurt them back in. I didn't get it. Hey guys, let's get started here.
Thank goodness, because I'm swamped here.
I'll say this a couple of times. If you haven't signed in with your contractor's numbers and stuff, make sure you do. It's right back here. Do you have employees? Do you have a bunch of employees? Or a couple?
Just three. Just three.
That's good size.
Yeah, that's enough.
I got to where I have 10 trucks and about 20 people.
That's something like that.
And when I was thinking of getting out of it, I cut back. And the last 2 years, it was just my son and I, and they formed my home for me the whole time I was in business. But I was 50, 51, 52, and it was getting harder for me to work that hard every day to went back. Yeah. When I had all the people take jobs.
Yeah, how long it is.
And they're not good jobs. If you're smaller, you can be a little more sensitive. The bill doesn't pay good.
Yeah.
All you doing is great.
Oh, yeah. It's always a problem. There's always a truck problem. There's always, you know, always someone's sick. Always someone's going through a divorce. Always someone. It's crazy. And then you have all your, you buy so much material. Making all that payroll. I get phone calls, hey, from the office, right now, payroll Friday, we need another $10,000. Bring up my receivables, you know, and I have $250,000 owed to me, but I don't have the last $10,000 or $12,000 on payroll, so what I do, actually it's money, so. I want to squeeze Hey, Dean, turn them on in, will
Holiday so far.
Okay, let's get going. It's kind of like getting the Boy Scouts all to be quiet and get together and get everything going, right? So I just talked a little bit about res check, quite a bit about res check, right? The second option, and probably the most popular option, is res check. So I get a lot of questions. I talked about continuous insulation, what's cavity insulation. I get tons and tons of questions about res check, or that the res checks are done wrong. But guess what? The res check software, which is free from energycodes.gov, free software, it has one. When you open res check, it has a little help box. And why more people don't click on the help box is beyond me, but there's pages and pages and pages of help. And so I've put in here a couple of pages of help. And for instance, in ceilings, it talks about flat ceilings or scissor trusses, what they are, wood frame ceiling structure with bats or loose fill placed between and on top of structural members. Then it goes on through. But while we're going through here, it talks about a raised or energy truss. How many are familiar with energy truss? Remember I talked about that bathroom in my first house where we had almost no insulation at the perimeter edge. You build a house with a PIP, and what do you have? You have very shallow insulation all the way around the entire edge of the building. So we don't have R38 or R49 there. We have poor insulation. What happens because of that? Poor insulation means we have heat loss goes up through, we melt the snow on the roof because it's warm there for that strip, but then we have the eave or the overhang on the roof, and what happens? It's cold underneath, so it melts, then freezes, we form an ice dam, and the water goes back up under the shingles, and that's why we put ice and water shield up at least 2 feet in. Well, the good thing is the best thing is put a raised heel or energy truss. Thank you. Anybody else need to add their contractor's number to this? If you want to get your DOPL credits, you need to make sure you get that Kimberly. So I've got it here. And if you don't have it with you, I guess you're going to have to get a hold of her and let her know. In fact, if you don't have your number and you just still want to sign in, so you're going to give it to her later, make sure you grab this at lunchtime. So what's an energy truss or high heel truss? It's just the truss is built so that we can put full height insulation all the way to the outside of the wall. We can get R38 or R49, whatever, all the way there. And yeah, the truss companies will charge you a little bit more just simply because they're going to use a little bit more material. But it is a better, more efficient assembly. And we have less condensation problems. And we have, we actually have better ventilation too, because we're not dealing with the insulation and trying to get baffles to let a little bit of air from the soffit up through.
And with that, you can do a trade-off on 38.
Right. If you're using the prescriptive table and you put high heel trusses, you don't have to put R49 in, you can put R38. It actually performs a little bit better because you have a true R38 everywhere rather than R38 and then R6 around the perimeter, or R8 or whatever it turns out to be. Ceiling software inputs. You put in gross area, cavity insulation, between ceiling structural members, including all blown insulation. Continuous insulation is insulation that runs continuously over structural members, free of significant thermal bridging, and it's something like rigid foam on the top of the deck. Floors, slab on grade. If you build a slab on grade floor like this in a residential building and in a commercial building, you have a requirement for, and it's right on this sheet, slab edge insulation. Here you need to have R10 4 feet deep. And that's slab edge insulation that comes to top of slab. And it explains what it is. And then it defines what is above grade or what slab on grade is. When you do slab on grade insulation, when you do your res check, you don't put in the area of the floor, you put in the perimeter length, the length of the exposed edge, because that's where our heat loss is taking place, is around the edge. Again, they talk about continuous insulation. And basically for slab edge insulation to count, and this diagram is in res check, it either comes up to top of slab on the inside, up to top of slab on the outside, then you have to protect it, or you can come down and extend out. But here it's 4 feet of insulation because of the depth of your frost. Or you can come down the thickness of your slab and then go in for 4 feet, a total of 4 feet. If you build with logs and you do the res check with logs, it tells you how you select the size of the log. Anyway, talks about basements. If it's at least 50% below grade by area, then it's called a basement wall. Here's a picture of insulated concrete forms. Here's the crawl space, and they give you a diagram on how you need to insulate that crawl space if you have a conditioned crawl space. You have a lot of crawl spaces out here. We ventilate most of them, or do we condition most of them? A warning on conditioned crawl spaces. Make sure, and this is one that I've seen some litigation on, make sure you have the good 6 mil or heavier vapor barrier on the ground, and you seal it, and you run up the walls and everything, so you stop that moisture from migrating up.
I have a question on that. Aren't you supposed to put a return in the crawl space?
If you're doing a conditioned crawl space, you need a small amount of supply and a return path. So it can be a louver that lets it go through the floor, you know, like a little floor grill or something, or you can actually have a little return. The big mistake I see on conditioning a crawl space is they put a furnace down there, set it horizontally, and they cut a supply on the plenum, then 5 feet away, they cut a hole in the return, and so all it does is short circuit air, and we don't ventilate the crawl space. See what I mean? We need air moving through the crawl space so that we pick up moisture or whatever and circulate it around and are able to exhaust it out of the system. So that means drop a little bit of air around like on the corners and then it's centrally return it back. Otherwise it doesn't work. Good question. Talks about doors. When we consider a solid door less than 50% glass, and it's a glass door if it's over 50% glass. And we even have that little formula I talked about, how we convert from U factor, from R value to U factor, or you can do the opposite and convert back the other way. The performance approach that I talked about, I'm not going to spend any time on it because I doubt you've ever seen one, or if you have, you've seen one or two over the years. This is where they model, and we have a proposed building and a standard reference building, and then we have a comparison, and this one is 36% more efficient than standard reference building. But it requires a whole bunch of inputs, but they need to, if they're doing this, they need to make sure the plans still identify what the insulation and the windows are going to be. Now here's the one that we were talking about a little bit earlier, the energy rating index. And I'm going to call it two things. I'm going to call it an ERI, energy rating index, or I'm going to call it a HERS rating. An energy rating index is a generic term that's in the code. And it's exactly what it says. It's a rating or a number that gives us a score. There is only one system out currently, and maybe someone else will produce one, but there's one process of scoring a home available today, and it's the home energy rating index. or the home energy rating score. And it's HERS rating. And so I'm going to use the terms interchangeably because HERS is the only one that's available. The code did not put in something developed by a private company that actually makes money off of it, because they're not going to mandate you have to use this system. What the code does is it has a list of things that need to be scored, and HERS happens to meet it. Someone else could put together a system, and if they use the same scoring things, you know, they might call it by a different name, but it's going to be a similar thing. It's kind of like all the automobile manufacturers have to use the same ratings to rate the mileage on your cars. So it's a standardized system on how to rate a home. If you take a 2006 residential energy code house that complied completely to the 2006 code, it would have a score of 100. So if you have a house that was built worse than that, then it's going to have a score higher than that. If you build a house better than the 2006 energy code, then you're going to have a score lower. And so we can tell if you put better insulation in it, it gets recognized. If you do better on air sealing, it gets recognized. If you do better on HVAC design, sizing, duct design, you get a better score. So all those things that involve energy consumption in your house are used to come up with that score. And the guy that does that HERS rating, you have to hire him, and he's going to charge you, I've heard anywhere from $300 to $1,000 to score your home. They also generally, these guys, as part of their system, the ones I know, they also take care of your utility rebates. If you're building a new home, I think a lot of you will be aware of this. If you're a general contractor, you can get rebates for putting in above code things. If you build better than the code, which would mean you have a better HERS rating, the gas company, the power company will give you some rebates. And sometimes the rebates are bigger. Often they're bigger than what you'd have to pay the guy to do your ratings. So it's kind of a thing that makes a lot of sense. And then they will work with you right from the first, before your plans are submitted, make sure everything's right. They will do a report that submits with your plans, and then they will make a couple of stops during the construction, and then they'll come out at the end and do a final walkthrough, test your home, and give you a score. Of course, like anything else, our legislature raised the numbers up, and so they're not as good as what the code says, but it's still 32% better than a 2006 home if you qualify, you know, if you use that score. So it's just a integer of one number, you know, no fractions or anything like that, and you get a score for your house. It's a pretty cool system. In fact, something that's really nice about it is this one looks at all the energy use in your home, and so it does give you credit for your furnaces and your water heaters and everything else. This one looks at your dishwashers, your ranges, your refrigerators. It looks at all of the energy use, your lighting, not just water heating and space heating like the modeling does. So it's a modeling on steroids with some testing involved with it. And then the last one I talked about before, the Utah 2012. When you're in res check, you'll bring it, it'll ask you what the code is, and you click on the code button and it lists all these codes. 2012, 15, 18, 21's going on it right now. And then it'll have a 7 or 8 for different states. And in there it'll say Utah 2012. You click on it, it loads the Utah 2012, it will print out as the Utah Energy Conservation Code. It doesn't say 12 up here, but that's the same thing. This is the last res check thing we're going to talk about. I'm just going to repeat that when you do a res check or you look at a res check, it says envelope assemblies. What are envelope assemblies? All those components separating conditioned from unconditioned space. You have to include them all. I had an apartment project I reviewed while I worked at Salt Lake County, and it was 3 stories of apartment on a post-tension slab with parking underneath. And he turned in a res check and it passed, but he didn't put the floor in for the bottom floor units. And those floors are over what? They're over an unconditioned space. Well, he left them out. Res check didn't know that there was supposed to be a floor there because it only knows what you put in. And I kept sending it back and I said, you got to include all the components of the thermal envelope. He had left out other things before. He left out rim joists and cantilevers and stuff like that that needed to be inputted. And he finally called me up and he says, well, you quit writing that down there? And I says, well, they put the floors in. And he says, I can't. And I says, why not? And he says, because it won't pass. Well, no kidding, it won't pass because you have a weak link with your floor because it had no insulation. What they ultimately did is they put automatic doors on the parking, and they did a little bit of insulation around on the walls, and they created what? A conditioned parking area, and they could get it to pass. The other option is you have to insulate the floor. Whether you put it on top of the floor and then sheet over it, or whether you put it underneath, you have to put all the components of the thermal envelope. If it's got cantilevers, you got to put them in. What's a cantilever? It's going to have a floor component to it, right? And it might be small or it might be big. If you have a bonus room over a garage, it needs to have a floor in it. If you have a basement, you either put the blanket on the walls or you insulate the floor. If you insulate the floor, then you have to insulate your duct and everything below. Where if you insulate the walls, you're inside the thermal envelope. Your duct doesn't have to be insulated. So the complete thermal envelope is what we have to do. And homes that have problems, over my more than 3 decades trying to chase down problems with homes that have problems often have insulation problems. You have that cold room. You know, someone wants a new furnace, the first thing they say is, I need a bigger furnace because I have a cold room. Well, the bigger furnace makes the problem worse, not better, because the furnace runs a shorter cycle rather than a longer one. But you know, it's because we have a weakness in our thermal envelope. So a couple of things we need to be looking at. And these are some of the mandatory things in the code. Our attic hatches. Well, let me ask this question. If you go around and open an attic in 100 homes here in Vernal and lift the access hatch, what's the chance that that piece of bad insulation that our insulation contractor left there is sitting off to the side and not set over the... Anybody want to venture? Your experience, what percentage is it sitting off the side and not over the 90%? 50? 90. The majority of them are sitting off the side. Because someone crawls up there and the first thing they do, they have to move this thing and all the fiberglass is falling on them. I know, I've been in way more attics than I ever wanted to. So for a couple of code cycles now, it says that insulation needs to be secured to the hatch. So if it's a piece of batt, then it needs to be glued and wired or strapped or somehow. On mine, my existing home, I put in a pull down, and then I have 4 pieces of polyiso, so it's 4 pieces an inch and a half, so I have like an R 30-something block that I glued together that I just dropped down on it. Gonna have a little ledge for it. You can glue. Somehow you got to secure the insulation for that. And of course it's board. I'm probably going to leave it so that someone can get in if they need to. So it needs to be secured, and then the real expense is you need to go to Lowe's and buy a little piece of foam strip and stick it around there so it doesn't leak air. Now we think that doesn't make a big difference, but if you take a thermal camera and you shoot some pictures, you're going to find a huge amount of heat loss or heat gain in the summertime coming through those attic accesses. Is it a big deal? It takes a little effort, but it's not a huge thing, and it's going to make a difference. Fenestration performance. First time I heard that word, I thought, what the heck is that? Fenestration is anything that we put in an opening in a building. Someone's not going to be able to get in. So a door, a window, a skylight is fenestration. And if we look at our table, it's called fenestration on here. Fenestration U factors. And those are rated in U factors. And they're going to be little labels stuck all over on the windows. And if they've taken the labels off, you might need to get receipts that show what windows they purchased. I threw this chart in simply for kind of a guide. Remember I talked about the 0.05 window? This is general, it's not exact because there's windows that are made better than others. And in fact, these are, but they're fairly close. A single clear piece of glass in a metal frame has a U factor of 1.29, which means that's an R 0.65, 0.7. So it's a terrible R value, which means we're going to have what? A lot of heat loss through it in the wintertime, a lot of heat gain in the summertime. We double it up in metal, and we still could be 0.83. That's pretty bad. And we can start doing things, and they didn't put in here thermal breaks, but we can have thermal breaks in our metal. Oh, there they did. And so that we go and we can get a little bit better. If we do low E and good solar heat gain and argon and all that stuff, we can get down to 0.42 with a metal window. That's a really good metal window. And then when we get down into non-metal windows, so that's going to be our wood and our vinyl and our fiberglass, we get 0.88 versus 0.129. It's the metal frame, because the metal frame is so conductive. And but you do notice the thermal breaks. So what do they do on these types of windows? You can buy from all the, well, you can, through your window guide, you can get thermal breaks on your storefront type frames. And you can get them with 1 or 2 thermal breaks. If you have 2 thermal breaks, you have aluminum, then a piece of nylon or some polymer material, then aluminum, then another break. And they're all bonded together. And the 2 thermal breaks helps improve because it reduces the amount of heat conduction. And then you can see what happens. Triple, we go start at 0.2 and go lower. With double low E, we can get down into 2.9, 2.8, 2.7. I've even seen some 2.6s and 2.5s. So I just put this in for a little bit of reference. If you're looking at a res check and it has a crazy number on it, you ought to look here and see if such a thing's available. If there's anything here, like one slide or all the slides, if you want a PDF of it, just send me an email and I'll just shoot you a copy of it full size because I know you can't read those 4 pages per slide. I don't print them all full page because I know half of those are going to go in the garbage anyway at the end of the day, maybe more. Same thing for doors. Doors can help you in your energy compliance because if they have they talk in this chart about how much window you have. If you do not have any window in it, and I don't think I threw that chart in, you can get down in the 0.15. See, this one has a quarter size window, but you're still 0.21 and 22. If you put in a solid foam insulated door with a wood thermal break around the edge, it's 0.15, and that can help you on your res check. It can help you pass because the requirement's 0.32, you're half that. It gives you some credit on your res check. Going to a home to inspect and there's no labels on the windows, you need to ask. Here's a good window that I encountered. Has a 0.21 U factor, but if you look close, it has 3 panes of glass. Now, one last thing. I've talked about SHGC or solar heat gain coefficient. This one says 0.2. If I back up to some of these, I don't know if we can read them. If you look at this chart here, solar heat gain coefficient, we'll see solar heat gain coefficients of 0.31, 0.2, 0.73. The solar heat gain coefficient identifies how much of the heat in the sun's rays make it into your building. Anybody have west-facing glass in their house to get hot? The sun beats through it and gets hot, doesn't it? East and west glass. East is not quite so bad because it's not as hot outside, but that west-facing glass is a killer. So we do what? We shade it and all those types of things. Well, one of the things the Energy Code recognizes is we need to try to reflect that. So if my number, let's say, is 0.73, that means 73% of the heat makes it into the house. So 27% gets reflected back. But you buy a good low-E window today, and if you're a builder and you go buy some good windows, it's going to be a 0.32 or something U factor, but it's going to have like a 0.30 or 31 solar heat gain coefficient, which means it reflects about 70% of the heat out and lets in about 30%. So it's an important number. Now, in our climate, we don't mandate really low numbers like they do in hotter climates. Hotter climates need a better solar heat gain coefficient, but it still makes a difference. The sun's rays have a bunch of different, they have infrared, they have ultraviolet, they have all these different things. Infrared is the heat, and we actually don't even see it. We have the VT, the visible transmitting, but the heat we don't see, but we feel it. It's what makes our cars hot when we park outside and the sun's beating through the glass. Insulation, installation, and we know we have an insulation guy back here. I remember when I went to work for Salt Lake City, I worked for Salt Lake City for 18 months, then I switched to the county when I first became an inspector. And I went out on a house, probably only been at it for about a month, and they knew I was, quote, the green inspector, even though I was an old man, in my 50s anyway. And the insulator, and I don't know if it was an insulation contractor, if the homeowner did it, or if the contractor did it himself, but you've seen the insulation where they come in and they just shoved it in the wall. They didn't cut around any of the boxes. They didn't cut it to the width, when you have a narrower space that isn't 14.5, that's 12 or 10 or whatever, they just kind of jammed it all in. They didn't cut them to length correctly. They just shoved it in and packed it and tucked it, packed it around the wires, did all those things. What do the manufacturer's installation instructions say about installing fiberglass bats? Anybody want to venture? It says you'll cut and fit it. So if you have a double stud wall, you cut and fit around it. If you have a corner, you make sure you fill all the voids. And it says cut and fit around wires, pipes, boxes, etc. So when a wire goes through, it should be cut or split so that it goes around the wire. If I have a 2x4 wall and I want to make it insulated better and I cram an R19 5.5 inch thick bat in it, do I have better insulation or worse? Worse. You compress it and it's like that down coat. It's all matted down and everything. You shake it so you get some air in it. It's warmer. It works better. Really, inspectors should be requiring a proper insulation installation. I'm a fan, based on my experience over the years, I'm a big fan of net and blown insulation. Big fan of it. Because why? Because it fills all those little voids. We don't have weak areas in our insulation. Okay, new in the last couple of code cycles, here we have 8-foot or 9-foot ceilings down here in this area, and then out here we have a scissor truss and we have a higher ceiling, right? And you probably see some of these. And so we have a little wall section, whether we call it a knee wall or just two different heights of ceilings, and we have insulation packed in there. And what's on the back side typically? Nothing, right? And if you crawl up into there later, you crawl up into that attic and you found that piece of bat that was supposed to be on the access panel sitting off the side, and you look over to those walls, what are you going to see a large percentage of the time? You're going to see insulation laying in the attic, aren't you? We've all seen it. Is insulation effective when it is not enclosed on all 6 sides? What do I mean by insulation enclosed on all 6 sides? Here's a piece, I'm going to use this again. Here's a piece of fiberglass insulation that I stick in a wall cavity. Goes from the top plate, bottom plate, stud on this side, stud on this side, OSB on this side, drywall on this side. What we are in effect doing is we're insulating and we're zipping up the coat. We're not leaving it open so the air can get in. Fiberglass insulation relies on air spaces within it. If we do not enclose the fiberglass insulation in walls, this is in walls because we have vertical surfaces on all 6 sides, which we are not doing on this insulation right here. We have the inside or the back side of our drywall that gets put over that is going to be fairly warm because it just has the drywall separating it from the conditioned space. So the air that's laying against the back side of the drywall that gets put up there is going to be warmer than the attic in the wintertime. So it's going to tend to rise. So as it rises, air is going to flow out of the insulation up top, and attic air is going to be drawn in at the bottom. And we're going to get a convective flow through that insulation. And it's just going to do like this. And if you take a thermal camera and you look at it, you can see the heat flow or the colder air moving through your insulation. It's like having a bunch of sweaters, but you don't have the windbreaker on. As soon as you get a little bit of air movement, our insulated value is gone. So the code is requiring now is when you do this, you put an air barrier on the back side. And what might that air barrier be? Right here. What do they put on it? Put Tyvek on it. What are the other things we need to think about? Now, can you put drywall on it? Sure, but it's gonna be a pain. Tyvek is an air barrier. Now, you need to be cautious because some of those building papers are not air barriers, they're just a moisture drainage screen kind of thing. And they're not air barriers, they're not airtight. So you need to be careful, but you need an air barrier anytime you have a knee wall so that you complete all 6 sides, so we don't have these convective flows of air through the insulation. Again, it's building science. Now, if you did all spray foam or something like that, it's closed cell and you don't have movement. We don't worry about the insulation blown on the lid because our convective flows are heat rising and we really don't get that with the horizontal insulation.
Before we do that, if you notice here, lots of times you'll see craft facing. Now, if you got craft facing, it's got to be against the sheetrock. You can't turn it around for the vapor barrier, because if you read on it, it says must be encapsulated because it burns like wildfire. So just remember, when you're 6-siding this, make sure it's Tyvek, something else. Don't leave the craft facing exposed.
Exactly. Please.
I don't want to disagree with that, but as long as that paper there is, the paper
It is, but if you read on it, it says must be encapsulated, and if you ever fired that, it burns like wildfire.
Yeah.
That's why you always put it in, like on the boards up against the floor or in between the studs against the sheetrock, so it can't flash across. So you have to use something else.
I'm glad you brought it up because you brought up for everybody up front in here. You brought vapor barrier. And the craft facing is vapor barrier. And how do they make it? Paper is not a vapor barrier. How do they make it a vapor barrier? It's got asphalt emulsion on the backside, right? And so that is the vapor barrier, might be 100%. He's saying you don't want to flip it around the other way this way. Or number one, we put vapor barrier on the wrong side, we got vapor barrier on the cold side. Big thing. I know this as an HVAC guy, kind of raise refrigerant lines to the heat. If you've got crap insulation in there and you're forcing it over here, it goes like crazy. I mean, you're relying on controlling the product. And when I worked for another company, when I first started, they broke down condominium project. Guys there raised mindsets. So we have 2 barriers that we have in our buildings. First one's an air barrier, the second one's a vapor barrier. And you're exactly right, that's what that's for. So maybe that installation isn't the simplest thing in the world. Maybe you don't want airspaces in it because that blows air movement that you're close to it. So if you do a craft face thing, really, they want it in contact with the drywall. So they don't want to cut back in, they want to flush the cables pulled out so that the drywall's high against the paper. Why? Because then you don't have this large amount of available air on combustion. So, now, while we're on it, I think I probably ought to say something about vapor barriers. There's a trend in the code, a lot of discussion in the code. I think we're going to see vapor barriers lessen and disappearing in a lot of our clients in the near future. The reason I say that is, what's a vapor barrier? It's basically it's plastic, usually, staple all across the walls, and installed properly. The code directs us to tape and seal around the boxes and to seal the openings in the back of the boxes where the wires come in, and to create a full vapor barrier on that outside wall. Is any home ever built that we have a full vapor tight air barrier? Vapor barrier? what's the first thing that happens? You do a beautiful vapor barrier, you do all this sealing. In fact, you can buy the boxes that have the little flanges on them with little gaskets. Put your visqueen up on them, tape them and all this stuff. And your drywall contractor comes in and does what? Comes in with his routers and around every single box. Do we have a vapor type barrier anymore? And so what is the purpose of that vapor barrier? We're trying to prevent that moisture from getting in there and condensing on the backside of our exterior sheathing. It's one of the things we're trying to do. And in reality, almost never does it do its job. And I'm of the opinion, and others are of the opinion, there's a lot of us that share this, and maybe you do or maybe you don't, that's okay, that by putting the plastic on it, we probably are hampering the ability of that moisture to dry back out when we get it in there. So that's not what the code specifically says, but that's kind of where we're going. But we do have some areas where we don't put the vapor barrier, like in basements and behind showers and stuff.
Well, comment on vapor barriers, and I haven't been 100% in favor of it too, because we go back to the 70s. Like this green was going to be the administrative stay in 3 years later, we got one.
Oh my.
My opinion, we're just.
You can actually go if you want. I
We're not
really.
getting involved in it.
Okay. Bye.
Systems, anytime this is installed and it's not happening. You know, they'll do intermittent fans and this and that to help the situation. But to me, if they're gonna do it, it needs to be a total program, get it done right, so you don't have some crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, but for those in back, Dean mentioned that in the 70s, we really thought, and these are the first model energy codes, the discussion was, vapor barriers are going to solve all of our problems because they serve dual purpose. They were an air barrier and a vapor barrier. And we even had this short period of time in Utah, and I remember it very, very well, because it was about 1976, 1977. We had, maybe it was even 75, but they came out and they said, vapor barriers are everywhere, ceilings too. I was working on a commercial project, and middle of the winter, finished all my rooftop units and everything on this commercial project. We didn't have gas yet, and so the drywallers come in, and you know, drywallers are paid by the piece, and so they're going like crazy. And they hung the lids and did the walls, had their salamander heaters in there, just burning away. Put on the first coat of mud. Next morning we come in, everybody shows up at work, and guess what? The ceilings were all laid on the floor. Why? They burn propane into space. What's a product of combustion? Water. They had plastic, because the building inspector said, you have to put plastic across the whole ceiling. Can any of the moisture get through? Nope. Saturated the drywall. What happens when drywall gets wet? Fails. To top it off, they went through and they did the first coat of mud. How much moisture is in the first coat of mud? A bunch of moisture. Like they soup it up a little bit for the tape, right? So there's more water in it. So you have all that and all the corners and all the seams and everything have that first thick coat of wet mud, adding all the water to it. No insulation above it, saturated and fell down. So vapor barriers immediately became not a requirement for the ceilings, but they still have for the walls. I agree with you, we've had lots of mold problems in our walls, and I think it's because if I spill water on the floor, it's going to dry relatively quickly. If I take some plastic, and say I have a few two-by-fours and stuff laying on the floor, so there's a little bit of airspace, and I cut some holes in the plastic, but throw plastic out over it, it's going to dry slower, even if there are holes in the plastic, isn't it? In fact, it might take weeks to dry out all the water underneath that piece of plastic. I think we're doing the same thing with our walls. And then you brought up the big point that we have to be thinking about, and that is, how about we control the moisture in our house? Now, someone out there is thinking, well, we're in a dry climate, we don't have any moisture. Do we have moisture in our houses and our buildings? Why? Because we live in them. How do we put moisture in our houses? We breathe. I'm putting more moisture than all of you guys because I'm sitting here flapping all day. So every time I talk, I put out more moisture than you do sitting there. So hence I'm drinking, trying to keep my throat moist. I'm sucking on a cough drop to keep my throat, moist and everything because I'm giving up moisture. You're all breathing. We can't very well say, hey, we got to stop breathing. So we're putting moisture in our air. Then sometimes we bathe. Some more than others, right? We cook. We mop floors. We wash dishes. We wash clothes. We water our plants. We flush toilets. We do all these things, and every one of them adds a little bit of moisture to the inside of our house. And so even though we are in a dry climate and we don't have moisture from the outside that we're dealing with, we're creating moisture inside our house, and we're going to have to deal with that. And if we don't ventilate our house, we got a problem. And we got a big problem. And our state amendments weaken the requirements in the code. If we did not amend our code in Utah, every single house built in Utah would have to be blower door tested. It'd be mandatory. The code as written says everything climbing zone 3 and higher must be blower door tested. Then they have an inspection air barrier checklist that you're supposed to follow, and then you're with the blower door test. And then it also says that you have to be 3 air changes per hour or tighter when pressure tested at 50 pascals. So that's the requirement without amendments. You have to test it, and it has to be down as low as 3 air changes per hour. But it also says in the code that if you're tighter than 5 air changes per hour, you have to mechanically ventilate. So without the amendments, we would blower door test everything, and we would mechanically ventilate everything because the blower door requirement is tighter than the trigger for mechanical ventilation. The state amendment is 3.5. It was 5, and then we went to 3.5. But the trigger by amendment is a 3. So until you get as tight as 3, I've got a slide up here, we'll talk a little bit more. Until we get as tight as 3, we don't have a mandatory triggering of mechanical ventilation. But we also have an option that you don't even have to blower door test. The amendment says you can do this inspection checklist or you can test. And because you're not being required to test, even if your house is real tight, there's no trigger to enforce mechanical ventilation. It's really a bad amendment. It's not good to the health of the home. And I know it's a pain, and I know it adds to the cost of the house, but there's a reason for all these things. Someone just didn't make them up and say, well, we're going to put this in because my brother-in-law owns Minneapolis blower door company or Retrotech blower door company. Sure, those people are going to make money off of it, but it's put in there because of the building science. And that's what we're talking about. Thanks for your comments. There's one last thing here, and it's on this slide, and I just want to point it out. You see this little white foam strip here? And maybe you can't see it very good from the far back, but that's just a little bit of a ribbon of foam, kind of like Seal Seal, not as dense as that blue Seal Seal that you put down on your plates. Why would we be putting it up there? where, you know, if you, and you can't see it very well, but back here where it's a flat ceiling, they put it around on all the top plates, all the way around the whole house.
It's supposed to seal the sheet rock when they put the sheet rock up.
It's a gasket. With blower door testing, that found that we have a lot of leakage at interior walls and exterior walls because the 2x4 top plate is not planed perfectly smooth so that the drywall is going to sit tight against it. We might have nails that aren't fully sunk. We might have a knob that's sticking out a little bit, so the drywall gets slapped up there. And crawl into an attic before it's insulated, and you can see all the top plates, right? And you can see the drywall butted up against it. And you could go around with a ruler or with a putty knife, and you could probably slide it down between the drywall and the top plate all over the place. And so it's a huge source of air leakage when you blower door test. And so that's one of the methods that you can improve the air leakage, reduce air leakage on your house, is just do that. Now there's some others. I know a couple of builders that as soon as the lids are in, they bring in the spray foam guy and he shoots a 1/2 inch across the whole top side of the drywall, the lids. Seals all the boxes, seals all the top plates, seals all the seams, seals all the penetrations that come up through the walls, instead of going around and trying to foam caulk all the wires that go up through. It seals everything. That's where that foam caulking, the foaming of all the little wires comes from, is we're trying to stop that leakage into the attic. Heat rises, and so anytime we have any heat in the house, it's going to tend to rise. The cold air falls. And so those are areas that we want to have our air barrier tight. Maybe a little harder to see, but when we have little bay windows and stuff like that, we have little 45-degree spaces, you know, that don't get insulated very well, and they're hard to seal unless we seal them on the outside. You take a thermal camera and look at those corners, it's pretty bad. Okay. Is that better, or does it make a difference?
I think it's better.
Yeah, I think that's better. And then we have our little spaces, the little spaces that aren't, you know, are they just packing insulation in there, are they spraying foam in them or whatever. And then the big one, you guys are general contractors that pay the lumber bills. Did they need this many studs on this side of this window? No, they didn't. I checked that house to see if the upper floor had a point low coming down, and there wasn't anything. There's a little space, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then this trimmer under here is 6. This jack only goes up to the header, but then you have the header. So this is R6 for a bunch of that. The average 16-inch center framing is 25% wood and 75% cavity. So when you have 25% is R3.5 or R6.5, I mean 5.5 for the 1 inch per R1 per inch, we have a lot of wall area that's not very good. Less than half the performance we want. Another reason why they push for insulation on the outside. Yeah, well, you can see the daylight through that corner. How easy is that to insulate? How airtight is that? You can, for your air barrier, you can do it, your drywall can be your air barrier, That's what they do on the ceiling, typically your ceiling, that has to be the drywall. But you can use your walls as your air barrier, but you're gonna need to do some gasketing and stuff and sealing of your boxes and everything if that's your air barrier. Lots of leakage. Cantilevers. When I bought the house I'm in right now, I have a bay window that's kind of like this. And what do you think they put on the underside of my bay window? Aluminum soffit, right? In J metal. Is aluminum soffit in J metal an air barrier? Lots of leakage, right? Lots and lots of leakage. So I bought the house, it was 13 years old, and we bought it in August. So it was nice and warm, and we hit this time of year, and we had our first cold snap, and I walked down one morning in bare feet and walked across the floor about 8 feet from the outside wall. And we had a little bit of breeze, a little bit of wind blowing up against the backside of the house. And as I walked across the floor, you could notice like a 20 or 30 or even 40 degree difference in the core temperature. And it was because the wind was blowing up the backside of my house, and that soffit in the J metal, of course, they're going to cut it a little bit loose. And so the wind was just going right in through it and right across my floor. And they had blocked the joists with their eye joists, and so the air just going right around the corners of the blocks. And what I ended up doing is I went and pulled all the metal off, and I had yellow insulation, but what color was the insulation? Black, almost brown black, because it was an air filter, is what it was. It was just catching all the dirt out of the air. But it showed that there was airflow. You open up a wall for an existing house and you see all these dirty streaks in your insulation. That's where air has been moving through the insulation, and it's catching the dust and stuff. The air barrier needs to cover that. We either need to have a piece of OSB on the bottom of it and then tie back or tie back. But we don't want to put Visqueen on it, because Visqueen would be a vapor barrier on the cold side, and it's going to condense like crazy on the top side of that piece of Visqueen. So lots of air movement through there and through the rim joist. So here's what we're looking at from inside on this house. This is a brand new house. These pictures are 1.5 years old. Don't we really see this though? I mean, isn't this the way we build a house? Here's our cantilever, you can see the bay. We can see where the base starts. We can see they put their bracket for holding holding the deck on that they put on out there, on this case. But here you can see the bay. Of course, they had to notch out the rim for the foundation bolts. We have the spaces beside them. Larger view. How are we going to seal that? Huh?
2-pound pole would be ideal.
Didn't I mention earlier, spray your rim joist? You solve a whole bunch of problems when you spray your rim joist. And yeah, I know it costs $1 inch per square foot for the foam, but it solves a whole bunch of problems, and it makes the home a lot more comfortable and stops air leakage, just solves a lot of problems. And this is, if I said it's a builder, you'd know the name. And they're one of the better builders. And they do try to address it, but they kind of missed the boat on just a couple of little items. Okay, I like to take, when we get just a little bit of snow, we really can get some telling pictures. When I look out my front door, I see this house. This is the newer subdivision, and it's straight down from my front, from the front of my house. There's 2 houses, on the side. But, you know, that's where the road curves, and they're right there. And what are we seeing? Number one, in this area and in this area. What are these two spots? I bet you know what they are.
Low air. Yeah.
It's the boots. It's the angle boots for the HVAC that aren't insulated. And yeah, I know I'm being ticky-tacky to say that the boots should be insulated, but they're right down at the edge. They're right down at the edge where we don't have enough depth to get any insulation over the top when you blow it. I mean, if we had energy trusses, I wouldn't be that worried about them because they're going to be buried well in the insulation. But where it is a standard truss, that boot is like within a ½ inch of the backside of the OSB. So really that boot should be pulled away a little bit. And then I got to where we started simply because of those types of things. We started taking a piece of duct wrap and just wrapping them over the top of our boots. Because the code says all duct in the attic needs to be insulated minimum R8. So that means return boxes, boots, Ys, Ts, plenums, everything that's not insulated flex needs to be insulated R8. And then over here, this furnace is sitting right there in that part of the attic. And because we have the furnace and the heat loss from the furnace with R8 duct, we have a lot of heat loss. So when we look at, while we're on that, when we look at this, what's the insulation requirement for an attic here? R49, right? And that's, I mean, it's R49 because it's easy, much easier to put high insulation in the attic, right? I don't think, you know, I mean, the gentleman back there could tell us the cost difference between 38 and 49, but it really doesn't matter. But once we get to 38 or 49, adding more insulation really doesn't do that much. We've really got the big bang out of it because we're going to have very little heat transfer through an R49 attic. You know, it's going to be, on a typical house, it'll probably be under 1,000 BTUs per hour. Might be like 700 or 800 BTUs per hour. So adding more insulation, if you double the insulation, you're only going to cut it in half. So going from 49 to 100, it's only going to save a few hundred BTUs. So we have as good as we're going to get with an R49, generally speaking. And what we're protecting, or what we're trying to, the heat flow that we're trying to stop is from a 70-degree space to maybe a 10-degree space in the wintertime, or a 75-degree space to a 140 or 150-degree space in the summertime. Remember I said heat flows because of two things, temperature difference and maybe I said it, maybe I didn't already. Heat flows because through this wall based on two factors, temperature in here, the temperature outside, and the amount of insulation. The greater the insulation, the less heat flow. The greater the temperature, the more heat flow. So where do we have the greatest temperature difference in a residential house today? It would be from, we'd say, from the house into the attic in the summertime. Because 75 inside the house might be our set point, and 150 might be our attic temperature, which happens all the time. So that's 75 degrees temperature difference. And we're trying to stop the heat with R49. So what if I put my heat and air conditioning system up in the attic, and then I suspend my duct out of the insulation so that hot air can get all the way around it, expose it to that 150-degree air? What is our temperature difference between the inside of the duct when the air conditioner is running and that attic? It's another 20 degrees. So instead of 75 degrees, it's 95 degrees temperature difference. So we're 95 degrees temperature difference between the inside of the duct and that hot attic. And how much insulation do we have? R8. The smallest insulation other than pipe insulation that we'll see. So we have just a little bit of insulation and the greatest temperature difference. And so if you're in a hot climate, like St. George, or a hot summer like we've had, we probably had some pretty hot temperatures out here, sticking all that stuff in the attic, not burying it in the insulation or getting it out of the attic can add 40 to 50% to your air conditioning costs. So if you have a place in St. George and you're paying $400 a month to cool it in the summertime, 200 of it you could get rid of if you brought the system inside your house. And we stop the flow with R8. It's kind of silly, isn't it? So there's discussion, and in humid climates they say no, you can't bury it in insulation, and that's in humid climates you need to be a little concerned. You got to make sure your vapor barrier's tight. But in our climate, burying, if you have to put it in the attic, keep it low. Don't stack it on top of each other. Keep it low, and then make sure you bury it as best you can in your attic flowing insulation, and it drastically improves the performance of your system and the efficiency. So that's from the HVAC. These are places you can see that they're probably what happened in some of these is they're just a piece of insulation missing, or I don't know what the case was with this one. I don't know if they completely missed it and it got drywalled 40 years ago. But look at how it's melting the snow off. That's the heat from inside the house. And then it's your fault if the HVAC system doesn't work, even though the insulation has a defect in it, right? And you can see the overhang. You can see the snow where it's cold underneath versus where it's warm inside. I've been in so many homes on inspection and I see something pulled back. Someone had to get in, a plumber, someone had to get in and do something. So they pulled the insulation back. And do the drywallers put everything back that they see laying down? You walk into a garage after it's drywalled, and I've seen this so many times it kind of makes my stomach sick. You walk in there, the drywall is all done in the garage, and I see a narrow piece of insulation sitting over here, and then a full piece of insulation sitting over here, and 2 or 3 pieces of insulation. You guys are all smiling because you've seen the same thing, haven't you? And we know that's a piece that got kicked out or blown out or knocked out, and it did not get put back into place. So that house forever has uninsulated spaces. Now it's just a little bit, but lots of little bits make a lot. I wouldn't want it on my house. Here's a duct at noon. As I understand it, lunch is on your own, and we'll take a 1-hour break for lunch. So that's the way they have it planned. The room, okay, a basement. We've touched on this, and let's just repeat it again real quick. So with the basement, if you have a basement, the simplest way is to just blanket the walls and create a conditioned basement. And by definition, you can indirectly condition that space by having the thermal envelope at the wall. You have duct that radiates a little bit of heat into the basement. You have heat flow from the uninsulated floors down in this space. You don't even have to put a supply and a return, and it'll be 60, 65 degrees. That's what we call indirectly conditioned, and we defined it in the code that way. So here they do a room, a storage room, and they have duct running through it, and they haven't studded the walls, and they didn't blanket the walls in this area. Everywhere else they studded it. All of a sudden they're creating a space that's unconditioned because they didn't blanket the walls. So how does this comply with the code? You either have to insulate the walls so you bring the duct all inside the space, or you insulate around the walls that separate conditioned from unconditioned space. And then you have to insulate the duct on the floor because it's an unconditioned space.
Why is the crawl space different than if you don't have to blow air in the basement?
Because you're gonna get so much leakage from your ductwork all over in there.
And that'd be the same as your crawl space with your duct.
Yeah, well, it's, typically our crawl space is insulated duct, right? It's not insulated with the crawl space, if you're vented, right?
Right.
I mean, not vented.
Not them.
But we get so much movement and it's a deep space, but the big thing is we don't have the moisture problem coming up from the floor. It's the moisture from the floor is what we're really concerned about, is moving some air through it. And these basements, I mean, they really get used for living space. I mean, every basement that I went into was doing service calls. If they had young kids, you know what was all over in the basement? Toys and bicycles and skateboards but yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but moisture, even in, well, do you remember we mentioned Boy Scouts earlier? Remember what they tell you if you're lost in the desert and you have a piece of plastic, you dig a hole in the ground, you put the plastic over it and you put a cup in the bottom with a rock in the plastic, and what happens? The moisture from the ground comes up and condenses on the bottom. Crawl spaces, we have moisture coming up from the ground all the time. That's why we're supposed to have vapor barriers on floors and do all those things, because we get a lot of moisture. Our basements have windows and stuff, they leak, they ventilate. So anyway, this is a problem that needs, because we have to try to define where that thermal envelope is. I don't know if you can see very good, but they framed a California corner or a corner so you can get insulation in there. I really like, this bib system or net and blow system where they net the whole thing and then they can blow the insulation in and fill all the voids. You know, if you're using ladder blocking like they are here, you can get insulation to fill in all those spaces where the bad insulation, you think it's going to be cut and fit around the hose bib and all the ladder blocking. No, it's not going. Need to make sure they're still doing something with the little narrow spots where they have a 1-inch space on your studs. Storage under a front porch. This is something that gets missed quite a bit. If you are creating a conditioned, indirectly conditioned space in the basement, you need to, if you have a storage room under the porch, you need to put a door on it with a gasket and a weather strip. Now, it doesn't have to be an exterior door, because a standard 2 or 3 or 6 panel door with the air spaces and everything, if you look at it and you look at the air spaces and you look at the materials, it's going to be better than, lower than 0.32, the requirement for it. So you can use your same interior doors, you're just going to need to mount it with a threshold and a weather strip to create that thermal barrier. Or you insulate the whole storage room under the garage, under the porch, but you don't want to do that. So here's the continuous insulation, and you see what? You know what? Let's break for lunch. Please try to be back on time. In fact, if we can start 10 minutes early, we'll leave 10 minutes early. So, kind of up to you. We'll see you about 1 o'clock.